The fantasy trade deadline is just around the corner, and if you're looking for trades to make in your leagues to put yourself in the best possible position to win your fantasy hockey championship, you came to the right place. Now, this was very much requested in the comment section as well as the Discord to break down week 23 to 25 playoffs for fantasy and going through some players for hypothetical trades that you can look to trade away or players that you should look to acquire to maximize your games played when it comes to playoffs. This is going to be a good video, guys. So as always, sit back, relax, and enjoy. So let's start it off with the worst playoff schedule. So first I want to emphasize we did have some questions about this in terms of when the actual weeks are. So March 24th would technically be week 23 of fantasy hockey, which spans until April 13th, which would technically be week 25 of fantasy hockey. So there are 5 notable teams here that have sort of weak schedules, with the Pittsburgh Penguins being the #1 worst schedule for these 3 weeks with a 29.55 goals against per game, which is cumulative between the 10 teams that they play against, meaning they have a very difficult schedule on top of playing just 10 games and 2 games total on the off nights. Now, there are 3 teams here that have just 10 total games: Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and Boston. St. Louis having the most difficult, or Boston having the second most difficult schedule, but with 1 game off, and St. Louis having the 3rd most difficult schedule with 2 total games off. Finally, we have Philadelphia Flyers and Winnipeg Jets. Now, I want to talk about Winnipeg a little bit because there are some players with a lot of value in Winnipeg that may be very difficult to part with. But if you can make trades for players that have very similar value, and I'll get into the hypothetical trades later in this video, you can definitely do that to get 2 extra games total, as well as 3-4 extra games on the off nights. So it's going to be difficult to part way with some of these really good players that have been carrying your fantasy team. Like for me, I have Mark Scheifele in one of my big leagues. It's going to be tough for me to look to trade him away, but if the value's there and it can help you out in the long term, it's definitely something you want to be doing. So like I mentioned, Philly, Winnipeg, 10 games for Philly, 3 games on the off nights with a difficult schedule. And then Winnipeg as well with 11 total games, 3 total games on the off night. Now, let's jump over to some of the players from these teams that you should look to trade away. So I've compiled a laundry list of players from these teams that I think have decent value that you can look to move to hopefully acquire some players from the better playoff scheduled teams. So starting us off with the Pittsburgh Penguins, we have 3 notable players here that should have a good amount of value. Sidney Crosby always has a ton of value, a very, very strong player. Now, I don't really want to run through all of their statistics, but with Crosby, a sole center position, big name player in a keeper league, he's a little bit more aging, so it could be a good time to move him away, even though he's honestly been just as good as later in his career than he was in his prime of his career. Second up, we have Rickard Rakell of the Pittsburgh Penguins as well. Triple position eligibility could be attractive for other managers. Also hard to part way with that. With Rickard Rakell, definitely a good sell high. He's been extremely good all season. Has just a little bit less points than Sidney Crosby this year in terms of fantasy points, as you can see on the right, with 477.8 to the 3rd highest on this list. So a good amount of value from Rakell, and this could be a very, very good trade target, as he was likely someone you either drafted very late in drafts or you added on the free agency. Moving over, the defenseman for the Pittsburgh Penguins, Erik Karlsson, who's been logging a ton of minutes for the Penguins as of recent. He's been good this season, played almost every single game, 36 points on the year, 138 shots, just under 400 fantasy points, which is pretty good for defensemen. Again, I'm using standard Yahoo fantasy points because it's very, very hard to pick and choose from different leagues. Everybody has different scoring, so I'm trying to standardize it as best as I can. So these are the 3 guys from the Pittsburgh Penguins who have the worst schedule that I would look to trade away. Now from the St. Louis Blues, 2 notable players that have, I would say, the 2 highest values on their team, in Jordan Kyrou and Colton Parayko. Kyrou was more of a mid-round draft pick for you. Center right wing eligible with 405 fantasy points this season. Should be able to return a decent player, and he is part of the hypothetical trades coming later in this video. Now, Colton Parayko here, just a great category defenseman. It's going to be tough to part ways with a guy that was drafted relatively late in your drafts that has been a mainstay on your back end as potentially defenseman 2 in some of your leagues. Now, with the Boston Bruins, I don't think trading away David Pastrnak is a good play at all unless you get a top 5 player in return. He's been good. He hasn't been great. He's likely maybe top 10 to 20 in some leagues where he was drafted around top 5 to 7. So with Brad Marchand here, should get a decent amount of value. He's played the whole year, 426 fantasy points, should return a decent player for Brad Marchand. Now with Travis Konechny, he's been excellent this season, well over a point per game of 58 points in 55 games. He's on the Philadelphia Flyers. I tried to fit the name in there. It was just too long. I didn't want to make any edits. But Konechny, Sanheim, those are the two guys from Philly I would look to trade away. Sanheim doesn't have a whole lot of value. It may actually be on your free agency, but maybe in those deeper leagues, you can move Sanheim away for a guy on some of the better teams. Lastly, the Winnipeg Jets guys, which are very difficult to part ways with. Now, I think Morrissey is okay for a keeper league if you're in like a 4-player keeper league and you're looking to keep a defenseman with Scheifele. I still don't think he's keeper material, even though he's been extremely good this season and may eclipse his career high. I think it was 42 goals. He may even beat that this season. I think Scheifele can return a massive player in return. Now, if your league has position specific, the center position is a very full position, meaning if you have a lot of centers, Scheifele could be a guy you can look to part ways with. And I'm going to get into some of the players, but first, let's jump over to the best playoff schedule. So taking a look at the best playoff schedule here, we have 5 teams that have very strong schedules for week 23 to 25. Starting us off with the Dallas Stars with one of the easiest schedules with 39.47 goals against per game, meaning their strength of schedule is relatively easy down the stretch for them. They have 13 games and 5 games on the off nights. So if you remember the Pittsburgh Penguins, 10 games, 2 games on the off nights, which means you can get an extra 3 games on the off nights with 3 total games. That should help you quite a bit. Now with Detroit here, they're tied with the most total off games at 6 with Edmonton and Minnesota, but they have 13 total games, a relatively easy schedule with 37.69 total goals against. So these are 2 definitely of my priorities here with Dallas and Detroit. Now with Montreal, you're also getting 13 games. You're getting the easiest possible schedule, meaning they should have some higher scoring games, and then 4 total games on the off nights. Now Edmonton, Minnesota here, it's difficult to pick and choose, and I'll get into the players a little bit later, but they do have some superstar players that are likely not really, like if you're in a competitive league, it's very unlikely those players do get moved. But these 2 teams, 12 games, 6 games on the off nights, so 1 less game than Dallas, Detroit, Montreal, but they both have 6 total games on the off nights, which is kind of where you want to be prioritizing your players. Because if you get 1 extra game, but you get 4 extra off-night games, that should significantly help your schedule and also help you stream players throughout the week. All right, so speaking of laundry list, I have a long list of players from those specific teams I think you should be looking to trade for based on their strong playoff schedule. So as mentioned, Dallas with the strongest schedule for the fantasy playoffs. So 3 players here: Jason Robertson, Wyatt Johnson, Roope Hintz. 3 guys are potential buy lows in this situation as well. We know Dallas's scoring has been extremely spread out this season, has been very sporadic for their top players this season. So these are definitely 3 strong targets. I think Wyatt Johnson may have the most value with the center right wing eligibility. I think the dual position eligibility maybe outduels him from Jason Robertson, as well as he was maybe taken a little bit later in drafts than Jason Robertson. So these are my 3 priority targets from the Dallas Stars. Be careful of Roope Hintz, just sole center position. Hasn't been the best this year, but still scoring at a pretty good pace. From the Detroit Red Wings, a lot to like here. This team's been rolling since Todd McClellan's come in. Larkin, DeBrincat, Seider, 3 of my key targets here. Larkin's been very good this season. Moritz Seider is potential keeper. He has keeper potential in most leagues with maybe 4+ players that you're keeping. So a lot to like there if you can acquire Seider and look at your team and maybe determine whether he can be a keeper for you or not. And then Alex DeBrincat here is very solid season. Not the highest in terms of fantasy points, which means you can maybe get him at a pretty good discount. Caulfield, Suzuki here. Caulfield has definitely been performing better than we've expected this season. I did have a future bet for him on 40 goals, so it's going to be a little close to see near the end of the season where he hits. But 2 very solid targets. Suzuki really brings no injury risk as well, which is definitely something you want to be considering here. But those are the 2 notable players from Montreal. I wanted to throw Slavkovsky in there, but he's a little bit more risky than those 2 other players. Now with Edmonton, as I mentioned, it's going to be difficult to get some of those big name players like Draisaitl, McDavid. Those guys are very difficult to acquire in leagues, especially with how good Draisaitl's been. Keeper leagues should be next to impossible unless you're giving up a lot of value for them. But with Hyman here, arguably the best buy low. I actually traded a 4th round pick and a player in one of my leagues to acquire him. A very solid buy low in my opinion. We have 4 keepers. So it's an 8th round pick value for Zach Hyman, who has a very strong playoff schedule, as well as been a great buy low for a guy that was likely top maybe 20 in some of your leagues last year, maybe top 25. So still should have a ton of value for the rest of the season. Evan Bouchard here, kind of the same story where he was likely a top 3 defenseman for you last year. Right now he's sitting around 10 to 12 in some leagues. So you can still get a decent amount of value from both Hyman and Bouchard here. Lastly, these Minnesota Wild players, I think Joel Eriksson Ek is a phenomenal buy low with under 300 fantasy points, by far the lowest on this list. Has missed some time to injury this year, as you can see with the games played with just 40 games, but he's a category covering machine. He was likely a top 50 player last season in some of your leagues, so a very good opportunity to try and buy in on Joel Eriksson Ek here. Matt Boldy may be a difficult target to acquire, but on being under a point per game and seeing all these other players that are relatively close to it, could make some fantasy managers be a little bit weary in terms of owning him, and this could be a good opportunity for you to look to try and trade for him. I think Boldy has keeper status in 4 or 3 keeper leagues. It depends on who else you roster. So there's definitely some value there. All right, time to make me nice and small. You can see me here in the bottom right corner. So let's jump into some of the hypothetical trades that could help you out for your playoffs. So on the left side of the screen here, as you can see, I have the best playoff schedule and the worst playoff schedule. So the first trade I have here is for Sidney Crosby, or trading away Sidney Crosby and acquiring Dylan Larkin. A very, very close trade, almost a 1-for-1, with Crosby edging him out by like 25 to 26 points there. Meaning you can look to trade away Crosby, acquire Larkin, very similar stats across the board. You get an additional 3 games and an additional 4 off-night games. So that's a pretty good trade for you in the long term. In terms of keeper leagues, I think it's relatively 1-for-1. Sid maybe have the edge for 2 more years, and then it gets a little bit closer. Moving on here, we have Rickard Rakell for Jason Robertson. Rakell surprisingly with like 53 more fantasy points than Jason Robertson. Very similar situation where you're trading a guy away that has 10 games, 2 off-night games for a guy with 13 games and 5 off-night games, as well as a very easy schedule. Stats are relatively the same across the board. Rakell edges him out definitely there in hits and power play points, which aren't included in this, but the fantasy points, Rakell has the edge, so you could be giving up a little bit more value for a guy that should help you with your playoff schedule. Lastly here, we have Jordan Kyrou for Alex DeBrincat. Jordan Kyrou, 405 fantasy points. Alex DeBrincat, 392.7. Very, very close in terms of value. Again, you're giving up the better valued player for Alex and Jordan Kyrou for a less value player in Alex DeBrincat, meaning it's likely that trade could go through to some fantasy managers. St. Louis, very similar to Pittsburgh, 10 games played, 2 off-night games, and you're acquiring a Detroit Red Wing player with left-wing, right-wing eligibility with 13 total games and 6 off-night games. Now on the left side of the screen, because it just blocked it on the far right side, I'm going to cover the FantasyPuck logo. You guys know who we are. So I have 3 more trades here for your fantasy playoffs. Now it's going to be a goaltending trade. Jordan Binnington for Cam Talbot. Very similar stats across the board. Talbot slightly edges him out by like 9 points here. So it's likely this trade could go through. Binnington definitely has the volume with 35 games started versus 27 for Talbot. Definitely like Talbot's upside for the rest of the season, given how good this Detroit Red Wings team has been over the last couple of games since Todd McClellan has joined the team. So this could be a solid 1-for-1 trade, no impact in keeper leagues. Moving on, we have Josh Morrissey. This is a blockbuster trade. Josh Morrissey for Mort Seider, straight up 1-for-1. Mort Seider with a little bit more value than Josh Morrissey with 441.8 fantasy points versus Josh Morrissey at 432.3. Again, you're going to be acquiring a guy that has 2 extra games, 3 extra games on the off nights for Mort Seider. Value is relatively the same across the board. I would almost give Seider the edge in category leagues, given how good he contributes to hits and blocks relative to Josh Morrissey. So he may even have more value in category leagues versus points leagues. But I think this is a very solid 1-for-1 trade. Lastly, this is maybe a pretty big swing for some players or for some fantasy managers, but giving up Rickard Rakell for Zach Hyman. Rickard, this is probably the biggest differential in terms of the trades we've suggested here, with over a 139 point difference here between Rickard Rakell and Zach Hyman this season for fantasy points, with just a 6-game swing between the 2 players. I like Hyman's upside for the rest of the season. You're going to get a guy with 2 extra games, 4 extra off-night games on a team with Connor McDavid on the top line with Zach Hyman. That is always good in the second half of the season. He struggled a ton out the gate, but the shot volume is still there. He's still getting a little bit unlucky in those high danger chances. So I do like this trade, Raquel for Hyman. Although you're giving up that center position eligibility for Hyman, I think in the long term it has a good amount of value. That will do it for the trade targets video for week 23 to 25 of fantasy playoffs. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, please subscribe. Good luck to everyone in their fantasy playoffs, guys. It's just around the corner. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video.